Let's move on to our next question. It's from Kevin Peterson. Sorry.
My question is to Sashi Tharoor. Happy Onam first.
Oh, thank you. You too.
You mentioned about Britain. Mentioned that Britain left India in a worse off condition than had it been without Britain. You also mentioned about reparation from Britain. What about the skills in engineering and manufacturing India acquired, the administrative and democratic processes it inherited, the infrastructure left behind, and most of all, the rapid education of the Indian people, of which you are an excellent example? Surely, no one can price these intangible values that were gained during the British rule in India and propelled the country to its present position as one of the leading countries in the world. Finally, one more question. I'm doing a Jeffrey Robertson here. In your opinion, where would India be today if the British did not step into India?
Oh, there's a lot there. It'll take the rest of the program to answer. I'll try and touch on it. But this is almost like the American saying to the widow of the American president, apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? I mean, really, the British came to one of the richest countries in the world, accounting for 27% of global GDP in 1700, 23% in 1800, and over 200 years of exploitation, depredation, loot and destruction, reduced it to a poster child for third world poverty, just over 3% of global GDP, 90% of the population living below the poverty line when the British left in 1947, a literacy rate, you speak of education, a literacy rate below 17%, and a life expectancy of 27. The growth rate of British India from 1900 to 1947 was 0.001%. That's what they were doing while draining the country of taxes and resources. Education, my gosh, the British, the last thing they wanted to do was invest in educating Indians. Will Durant, the American historian traveling in India as late as 1930, pointed out that the entire expenditure of the British on education in India, from the nursery level to the highest universities, was less than half the high school budget of the state of New York. All the Indian institutes of technology, the engineering achievements you're talking about, were established after independence by the government of India. There is simply no comparison between the accomplishments of India rising from the ashes the British left us in and what was done in 200 years. I've given many figures.
Just take one example, the textile industry, because India was a huge exporter of
For 2,000 years, it was the world's leading exporter.
What happened?
In fact, in the Roman Empire, there are debates recorded by Pliny the Elder of Roman senators complaining about the amount of the Roman Empire's gold that was being sent off to India because of the tastes of Roman women for Indian muslins, linens and cottons.
Was it just modernism, the Industrial Revolution that destroyed it, or was it something else?
No, that's the excuse that apologists like to make, that, oh, it's not our fault, you just missed the bus for the Industrial Revolution. Well, we missed the bus because you threw us under its wheels, is what I tell the Brits. I mean, the fact is, in the name of free trade, the British came in and destroyed the free trade that had made India a leading exporter of textiles. The British soldiers smashed the looms so people couldn't practice their craft. They imposed punitive duties and taxes on the export of Indian textiles while lifting duties on the import of British cloth. And they achieved a captive market at the point of a gun. This is not exactly free trade, as you can imagine. Cities like Murshidabad and Dhaka in the subcontinent were depopulated. In one notorious incident, weavers had their thumbs cut off, so when the looms were repaired, they couldn't weave again. Textiles were systematically destroyed as an industry by the British. And that's only one example of many.
Well, I'm going to quickly go back to our question. Now, Kevin, do you accept that perhaps the British weren't quite as benign as you've just suggested?
Please read the book, Kevin. There's a lot more there.
I've got the book.
I'll bring Laurie in here. He gave a speech along these lines to the Oxford Union, got wild applause from the students and others sitting around the Oxford Union Hall. And I'm just wondering, have young Brits come to terms with their colonial past?
No, we haven't at all. Young Brits of every class have no idea about our colonial past, and that is being deliberately done. We are deliberately denied or kept away from education about the graphic facts of what the British did around the world, including in this country, to the people of this country. The crimes of the British and the crimes that we committed and that were done in our names over 400 years of pillage and conquest is something that we don't like to think about, and yet it is everywhere in modern British history. When people talk about Brexit, it's stunning to me that if you ask British people who voted for Brexit what their major fear is, their fear is that people will come to our country and take our things. And
that's exactly...
why... I just can't... It doesn't compute, but we don't know this history. I took history in British schools up to the age of 18, and I got a pretty good grade. And
You never learned a line of colonial history, did you?
Well, almost everything that you have just said, I learned from your book.
I'm going to throw quickly back to Sashi because one of the great heroes of the Second World War, in fact of the 20th century, Winston Churchill, you've basically accused him in your book of complicity in a famine that killed 4 million Bengalis.
Rightly so.
4.3. I mean, Churchill personally took the decisions that actually not only plunged Bengal into starvation, but had the British actually purchase grain that the Bengalis could barely afford to buy in order to ship it to Europe, not to aid the war effort, as his defenders claim, but to boost the buffer stocks in the event of a future possible invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. People started dying, and Churchill said, well, it's all their fault anyway for breeding like rabbits. He said, I hate the Indians. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion. Australian ships were docking in Calcutta port and were ordered by Churchill and his odious paymaster, General Lord Chauvel, not to disembark their wheat, but to sail on to Europe, where their wheat might be used in some future reserve stock. On top of that, when conscience-stricken British officials...
Yes, I was going to say, did Churchill know people were dying?
Yes, conscience-stricken British officials are constantly sending memoranda to the Prime Minister personally, because it was his decision, saying that people were dying literally on the streets, and all Churchill could bring himself to do was write peevishly on the side of the file, why hasn't Gandhi died yet?
Wow.
And this is the man the British want us to hail as an apostle of freedom and democracy, when he has as much blood on his hands as some of the worst genocidal dictators of the 20th century.
Well, thank you. You underlined that point so well, we can let others debate it. You're watching the Melbourne Writers' Festival Q&A. If you have a question for our political leaders, join Q&A in the House this week. Sashi, you're a politician. What do you think? I mean, obviously you've spent a lot of time looking at this and thinking about it.
Well, I think part of the problem really is that every movement creates or provokes a reaction, and there's going to be reactions, whether it's the right that's making advances or the left. There's no question that the world has moved on. I don't think this show, when it first began, would necessarily have had the first guest acknowledging the owners of the land and paying tribute to their elders. That's already a sign of respect for a sensitivity that was ignored in the past in Australia. I think you'll certainly find that the way in which the discourse has moved around the world on things like homosexual rights, on things like other privileges for same-sex couples, transgenders, all of this...
Not moving very fast in India, your own country, I should say.
Well, transgenders, curiously, is moving faster than same-sex relationships in terms of political acceptability, simply because culturally we've simply been used to them being around all this time. Homosexuality, frankly, was completely acceptable in Indian culture for 2,000 years, till the Brits came along and outlawed it. Yeah. And then we have
we are going to come... We're going to come to your notions of the Brits.
I think, Laurie, there's actually two kinds of backlash going on in the world right now. There is a backlash against globalization, which has created winners and losers, and these people see themselves as losers. And they ask why they should vote for politicians or sending their jobs off to Shanghai. But there's also a cultural backlash going on. I think Michael talked about the globalized elites, right? Hillary and Goldman Sachs, all of this stuff. It was a revolt against Davos man on the economic front, but was also a revolt for greater cultural authenticity, religious identity, nationalism. All of these things, I think, lay behind Trump, lay behind Brexit, lie behind Geert Wilders in the Netherlands or Marine Le Pen in France. This is a phenomenon that's worldwide. I mean, the details, the manifestation may vary from place to place. But these two backlashes are taking place. Sometimes they're both together. Sometimes they're separate. For India, we have a cultural backlash with a party that's very much, for a religious identity, just like Turkey. But we don't have a backlash against globalization. They want to be Davos man. They don't want to reject Davos man.
Well, look, I'm going to say the question was really about whether the discussion will change outside of the Western countries where it's become a kind of dominant symbolic argument.
Well, the Western countries have an influence to some degree. But for example, in India, I tried to introduce a law that will simply decriminalize consensual sexual relations between consenting adults. And I was shouted down by the ruling party to a point that 2 attempts to just introduce a bill were not permitted. In other words, a bill never even got introduced, let alone discussed. That's the kind of resistance we're facing in India. Now, fortunately, the Supreme Court has just given a ruling on the right to privacy that suggests we could very easily apply that in a court action to these issues, and that could in turn widen the scope. Initially, once you make, people's right to love each other legal, only then can you start thinking about things like marriage. We haven't got there yet. We have to take the first step first.
Do you equate your government, incidentally, the Modi government, with...
And the opposition, not my government.
No.
It is my government.
Yes,
it's my
the government of
stuff.
India,
Yes.
the Modi government. Do you sort of equate that with the religious right in other countries?
In many ways, yes. I think Mr. Modi, to his credit, hasn't himself, since becoming Prime Minister, said anything particularly directly bigoted, as he used to in his previous incarnation and during his campaigns. But he's unleashed forces that are really no different in many ways from the kind of right-wing religious talk we've seen in other countries from other religions. So it really is worrying that we're seeing a kind of naked chauvinism that wasn't polite to even express in the old days in India.
Shashi, former diplomat, what do you think?
Well, I think we've got to think for a minute that maybe the actors in this are not as irrational as they seem to all of us. And Kim Jong-un probably is looking, for example, at Saddam Hussein's experience, is saying this guy boasted about weapons of mass destruction and he got overthrown by the Americans for his pains. Let me show them I have weapons of mass destruction and they won't dare to overthrow me. So it's a way of buying himself, in a sense, perpetuity, regime insurance, if you like, or insurance against regime change. In some ways, therefore, what he's doing with all of this is saying, don't try and overthrow me because the price you'll have to pay is far too high to pay. He's saying, Seoul is easy for me to take out. Guam is easy for me to nuke. Japan is within the range of my missiles. That's why he just fired one above it. San Francisco isn't too far away either, folks. So do you want to play that kind of hardball with me? Or will you leave me alone to be myself?
Is that the sort of hardball that India plays with Pakistan?
Oh, I wish. No.
Because, both North Korea, India and Pakistan, well, the three of them have all broken international laws in order to build a nuclear
not exactly.
arsenal.
No, it's a little more complicated than that. India has...
Not that much more complicated.
Well, it is. India rightly, I think, considered the non-proliferation treaty to be an abomination. It's the last existence of apartheid in international law, where a bunch of countries says that we are entitled to have something that the rest of you are not. I mean, that's racism plain and simple, and it will not be acceptable.
That's the argument of North Korea.
Exactly. So what I'm trying to say is maybe we'll have to live with a nuclear North Korea. As Tom Lehrer said in the famous lyric, the Lord's our shepherd, says the psalm, but just in case, we better have a bomb. That's exactly what Kim Jong-un is thinking. I don't admire the man. He's everything that Michael says he is. He's a nasty character. He's a Stalinist dictator. He's putting his people in great misery and poverty. But at the same time, if you think of him as a rational actor, what he's doing is a fairly rational calculation. And I think it should give pause to anybody who might be contemplating any military adventure against North Korea. The price would be far too high to pay.
Thank you. Now, QnA is live across Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time. And you can stream us around the world on YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. Well, our first question comes from Katie McDonald.
Laurie Penny, in the wake of Brexit and the Trump presidency, many have blamed radical progressive liberalism and the rise of political correctness. it is argued that movements such as feminism and equal rights for minorities have alienated and agitated a silent majority that are now revolting against the Liberal agenda. With this in mind, how do we continue to fight for equality and equity for all without aggravating or disenfranchising the other side?
Well, Laurie, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back. Thank you for your question. Before I answer, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on. I'm really hoping I'm going to say this right. The Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and future. We've been hearing this a lot since Brexit, since the election of Donald Trump, that really it's the left's fault and it's women's fault and it's Muslim people's fault and the fault of people of colour for just asking for too much equality and too much change. And really, it's look what you made us do, is what I hear. And it is the language of an abuser, and it is the language of children. The idea that you are so aggravated by any threat to your sense of superiority, so agitated by any threat to your own privilege that a sudden lack of privilege feels like prejudice. Well, it's not prejudice. It is, I don't think, as political people, as activists, and as people who care about a livable future for the human race, we should be moderating our language at this point. The opposite. I think this is when we go harder, because ultimately you can't do feminism, you can't do anti-racism, you can't do any kind of political politics, any kind of progressive politics, if your first objective is to make the other side feel comfortable. That's a way to just scupper yourself before you're out of the gate.
Laurie, when you're talking about it in terms of sides, is that part of the problem that's been identified by the questioner? Are progressive movements moving too fast for a section of the population in the United States, in Britain, and in parts of Australia?
Well, I'm sure some people do feel uncomfortable with the pace of social change, but I would suggest they get used to it. Really, I don't think it's my job to make people who are sexist feel more comfortable. I'm not a politician, I'm a writer, and my job is to push the discussion forward. And if I'm so there is a difference. If I'm saying, I think that I should have more rights to bodily autonomy, and you say, I don't know what you actually think about this, but let's say you say, well, that makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. My job then is not to say, well, I'm sorry you feel uncomfortable. Your feelings are obviously more important than my right to bodily autonomy. Those things aren't equal. It's not. We seem to think that the feelings of people in positions of power are of equal importance and equal moral value to the basic right to life and autonomy of people who don't have that privilege. I think that's wrong.
Let's quickly go back to Katie, our questioner. What do you think? I mean, you raise this issue. I mean, do you think there's a genuine disaffection out there in parts of the community? The progressive movements are going too fast for them?
I have always believed pretty much what Laurie has been saying up until Trump was voted in. And I began to question my hardline progressive view. I still am progressive, and I still would say I'm a feminist. But I also am concerned about ignoring or alienating another group and ending up.
It's not your fault.
Yeah.
It's not. Donald Trump is not your fault. It's no, really, we really should, I really get, in some ways, there is this paradoxical way where when we hear, it's kind of our fault we went too far, there is something almost a little bit empowering about that in a toxic way, thinking, well, maybe if we'd made a different choice, then it could have been different. Actually, no, Donald Trump is the fault of racists and sexists.
Sashi, you're a politician. What do you think? I mean, obviously you've spent a lot of time looking at this and thinking about it.
Well, I think part of the problem really is that every movement creates or provokes a reaction, and there's going to be reactions, whether it's the right that's making advances or the left. There's no question that the world has moved on. I don't think this show, when it first began, would necessarily have had the first guest acknowledging the owners of the land and paying tribute to their elders. That's already a sign of respect for a sensitivity that was ignored in the past in Australia. I think you'll certainly find that the way in which the discourse has moved around the world on things like homosexual rights, on things like other privileges for same-sex couples, transgenders, all of this...
Not moving very fast in India, your own country, I should say.
Well, transgender security is moving faster than same-sex relationships in terms of political acceptability, simply because culturally we've simply been used to them being around all this time. Homosexuality, frankly, was completely acceptable in Indian culture for 2,000 years, till the Brits came along and outlawed it. And then we have
we are going to come... We're going to come to your notions of the Brits.
I think, Laurie, there's actually two kinds of backlash going on in the world right now. There is a backlash against globalization, which has created winners and losers, and these people see themselves as losers. And they ask why they should vote for politicians who are sending their jobs off to Shanghai. But there's also a cultural backlash going on. I think Michael talked about the globalized elites, right? Hillary and Goldman Sachs, all of this stuff. It was a revolt against Davos man on the economic front, but was also a revolt for greater cultural authenticity, religious identity, nationalism. All of these things, I think, lay behind Trump, lay behind Brexit, lie behind Geert Wilders in the Netherlands or Marine Le Pen in France. This is a phenomenon that's worldwide. I mean, the details, the manifestation may vary from place to place. But these two backlashes are taking place. Sometimes they're both together. Sometimes they're separate. For India, we have a cultural backlash with a party that's very much, for a religious identity, just like Turkey. But we don't have a backlash against globalization. They want to be Davos man. They don't want to reject Davos man.
Well, look, I'm